Each morning, I'd wake up to the sound of the alarm at 6:30. I knew the day ahead would be filled with the usual routines. Life with Ethan, my husband, felt stable and predictable. We lived in a cozy house on a quiet street in Boston, where everyone knew each other. Our evenings were spent together, enjoying dinner and talking about our future plans. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. There was something important slipping away from my happiness. When my younger brother, Liam, decided to stay with us for a few months after graduating from college, I had no idea how much our lives would change. Liam had always been the life of the party. His energy and enthusiasm were infectious. I was happy to spend more time with him, help him adjust to life after college, and listen to his stories from school. The first few days passed smoothly. We cooked dinner together, took walks in the park, and talked about the news and our plans. Liam shared his dream of opening a cafe, and his passion and confidence really inspired me. His presence brought a new energy and joy to our evenings, but I couldn't help but notice how often he smiled at me and how his gaze lingered a bit longer than usual. One warm summer evening, we decided to have a barbecue in the backyard. Ethan was busy with work, but he still managed to keep up with the conversations and jokes over the phone. Liam and I took care of the food, spread a blanket out, and sat on the terrace, enjoying the sunset. The light caught his face in a way that made him look even more attractive. We laughed and shared stories, and I began to feel something stronger than just family affection. Slowly, I found myself thinking about Liam more and more. His laughter, his eyes, his caring nature, these things started to take up more space in my heart. I tried to convince myself it was just a temporary reaction to his presence. But with each passing day, those feelings grew more intense, leaving me torn inside. One evening, when Ethan was working late on a big project, Liam and I found ourselves alone at home. We were sitting on the terrace, talking about his future plans, when suddenly he turned to me and said, "Ava, you've always been a role model for me. I admire you more than I can express." His words caught me off guard. My heart started racing, and for a moment, I was speechless, trying to figure out what he meant. There was a mix of embarrassment and growing tension between us. As night fell, we both sat in our thoughts. After that conversation, everything around me seemed unchanged. But inside, everything was different. Every day spent with Liam added to the unease I felt. Our conversations were still easy and casual, but now every interaction seemed charged with a silent tension. I tried to stay calm, pretending everything was normal, but deep down I knew it wasn't. Liam began spending more time with me. He'd offer to help with chores, join me on errands, and I couldn't ignore how often he sought my gaze every time our eyes met. It made my heart race. I kept telling myself that I was imagining things, misreading his actions, but with each passing day, it became harder to deny what I was feeling. One morning, after Ethan had left for work, Liam suggested we go to the beach. The day was warm, and I thought it would be a good chance to relax and clear my head. We picked a small, secluded beach with hardly anyone around. After laying down a towel, we sat together, and once again, I felt that strange, dangerous pull between us. "Sometimes I feel like running away from everything and starting fresh," Liam said, his eyes fixed on the horizon. His words lingered in the air, and I had no response. But his gaze spoke volumes. I could see he felt the same way. We sat quietly, listening to the waves, and eventually, I realized I couldn't keep pretending that nothing was happening between us. For too long, I had buried my feelings behind a mask of calm and logic. But in that moment, I couldn't deny them any longer. Suddenly, Liam turned toward me and locked eyes with mine. His gaze was filled with both anxiety and determination. "Have you ever thought about starting over?" he asked softly. Those words hit me like a cold gust of wind. I was silent for a long time, unsure how to answer. My heart was pounding so loudly, I thought he might hear it. I whispered, looking away. I didn't even notice how close he had gotten until his hand gently touched my cheek. I couldn't pull away. And then, our lips met in a kiss that was brief, but intense. In that moment, it felt like everything I had been missing in my life suddenly came rushing in. Everything inside me shifted. I knew it was wrong, that I had crossed a line I shouldn't have, but in that instant, I couldn't stop myself. The kiss was short, but it said more than 1,000 words. It was a silent confession of everything we had both been too afraid to admit, even to ourselves. When the kiss ended, I pulled away quickly, as if realizing the enormity of what I'd just done. Liam looked equally stunned. We both sat there in silence, breathing heavily, trying to process what had just happened. When I looked at him, I saw the same emotion in his eyes, a mix of fear and regret. The drive back was silent, an oppressive quiet that seemed unbearable. I tried to convince myself that it was just a mistake, something I could forget, but deep down I knew that was easier said than done. But deep down, I knew it was impossible to turn back now. We had crossed a line, and there was no going back. That night, as I lay in bed next to Ethan, sleep eluded me. Thoughts of what had happened on the beach kept spinning in my mind. Guilt tangled with excitement, and I couldn't understand what was happening to me. Meanwhile, Ethan, completely oblivious, slept soundly beside me, and that only made the inner conflict worse. As the days passed, the tension grew unbearable. Liam was still around, and our unspoken understanding about what had happened made our interactions even more strained. Every glance, every small gesture was charged with unspoken meaning. It felt like my once calm life was turning into a storm, one that I could no longer control. One evening, when Ethan was working late again, Liam came to find me in the living room. He sat down next to me and quietly said, "Ava, what's happening to us?" There was real concern in his voice. I knew I couldn't avoid this conversation, but the words were stuck in my throat. Before I could say anything, he leaned in and took my hand. In that moment, I realized we were both falling into a situation we couldn't escape from. After that kiss on the beach and our quiet exchange in the living room, a heavy silence settled between Liam and me, filled with the weight of inevitability. We both knew we had crossed a line, one that could never be undone, but neither of us dared to move further. I kept trying to convince myself it was just a brief lapse, that nothing like this would happen again. But every time our eyes met, that fire inside me flared up again, and it became impossible to ignore. The atmosphere in the house grew tense. Ethan remained oblivious, lost in his work. He came home late, and our conversations turned into mundane exchanges about work and household matters. I tried to maintain normalcy, but every word from Ethan felt like a knife to my conscience. I knew I was betraying him, and that thought gnawed at me constantly. Liam, for his part, tried to give me space, but his attempts came across as awkward and forced. We pretended nothing had happened, but that only made everything worse. Our few conversations were filled with tension, laden with unsaid words and hidden meanings. Every time his hand brushed mine, or his gaze lingered too long, my heart would skip a beat. One day, when Ethan went away to visit his parents for the weekend, Liam suggested we take a day trip to New York. "Let's just get away for a bit, see an exhibit, walk around the city," he said, trying to sound casual. I knew it was probably a mistake, but something inside me urged me to say yes. I lied to Ethan, telling him I was meeting a friend, and the next morning, Liam and I set off for the city. New York greeted us with its usual buzz, and for a while, I managed to push aside my doubts. We wandered through the streets, chatting about trivial things, laughing as though nothing had happened. Liam was attentive and polite, and I felt light, free even in his company. But beneath the surface, something much deeper was at play, something we both feared facing. We visited a small contemporary art museum in Manhattan. The bold, vibrant works of art seemed to reflect the chaos inside me. Liam made the occasional comment about the pieces, but I barely heard him. My mind was entirely consumed with what was happening between us. After the museum, we stopped by a quiet cafe to rest. Sitting at a table by the window, I watched the people rush past on the street, trying to convince myself that everything could still be fixed. But each time my eyes met Liam's, that fragile hope melted away, like snow under the sun. Eventually, Liam leaned in closer and quietly asked, "Have you ever thought about leaving everything behind and starting over?" His voice was full of sincerity and pain. In that moment, I realized how close we were to the edge. I felt tears welling up, but managed to hold them back. "Sometimes," I whispered, barely audible, looking away. I couldn't bear to look him in the eyes because I knew if I did, I wouldn't be able to stop what was happening. Liam stayed silent, but his silence spoke louder than anything he could have said. We returned to Boston late that evening. The house greeted us with silence and dim lighting. Ethan wasn't home yet, and while I felt a fleeting sense of relief, the guilt inside me only grew stronger. I tried to tell myself that the day meant nothing, that I could stop this before it went any further. But as soon as I stepped through the door, I knew everything had already changed. Liam followed me inside, and just as I was about to say goodbye, he suddenly stopped at the door and softly said, "Ava, I can't pretend anymore. I need to know how you feel." His voice trembled with emotion, and in that moment, I realized I could no longer hide behind a mask. I slowly turned to face him, feeling something inside me crack. "Liam," I started, but the words caught in my throat. I knew that once I spoke, everything would be shattered. But remaining silent was no longer an option. We stood there, both lost in thought, at the threshold of the house. And in that moment, I realized everything had already been decided. Liam stepped closer, and I felt a fire ignite inside me. I knew I shouldn't, but I couldn't stop myself. Our lips met again, and this kiss was different, full of despair and tenderness, as if we both knew this could be the end. After that night in New York, after that kiss at the doorstep, my entire world began to fall apart. Inside me, everything moved at a frantic pace. Emotions raged out of control while my mind scrambled to find an escape from the mess I had made. Each day became a torment, filled with guilt and fear. I tried to act normal, but I knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. Ethan, still lost in his work, seemed oblivious, but his absence at home had become unbearable for me. In any other situation, I would have appreciated Ethan's efforts, his care for us, but now, every simple word or gesture from him felt like a dagger to my heart. I hated myself for deceiving him, but at the same time, I couldn't bring myself to end things with Liam. Our feelings had grown too strong to ignore. Liam, on the other hand, began to pull away more and more. We spoke less, and our encounters became increasingly tense, filled with things left unsaid. He seemed lost, just as unsure of how to deal with what was happening between us as I was. The doubts that tormented me seemed to be eating at him too, and every conversation we had ended in silence, without any resolution. We both knew we were on a path that led nowhere, but neither of us could stop walking down it. One evening, Ethan came home earlier than usual, and I could feel the end was near. He was unusually quiet, and despite my best efforts to act normally, he noticed the tension in the air. We ate dinner in silence, and I could feel something inevitable hanging between us. After dinner, Ethan suddenly fixed his gaze on me with a serious expression. "Ava, what's going on?" he asked softly, his voice laced with concern and suspicion. I froze, unsure of how to respond. My heart raced, so loudly that I was sure he could hear it. "Nothing. Everything's fine," I lied, but even I knew how unconvincing it sounded. He didn't break eye contact, and I knew then that I couldn't keep up the facade. "Ava," he said, his voice strained. "I know something's going on. You've changed, and I can't ignore it anymore." I froze again, realizing that the moment of truth had finally arrived. My words were stuck in my throat. I knew I couldn't hide the truth anymore, but the fear of his reaction paralyzed me. There was a violent tug-of-war inside me, a battle between wanting to tell him the truth and the terror of destroying what was left of our relationship. "Ethan," I started, my voice trembling as I tried to find the right words. I made a terrible mistake." His face went pale, and I saw the panic rising in his eyes. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I took a deep breath, summoning all my courage, and whispered, "I had an affair with Liam." The room went completely still. The silence was suffocating. Ethan didn't move, his eyes wide with a mix of shock, pain, and disbelief. I could see his mind racing, trying to comprehend what I had just said, but it was too much to take in. You with my brother? His voice was barely audible, filled with disbelief. I nodded, too ashamed to even try to explain or justify myself. I watched as his expression twisted, his hands balling into fists. It was clear to me in that moment that our relationship was beyond repair. How could you? He spat, his voice laced with anger. He stepped toward me, then stopped, as though afraid of what he might do if he got too close. I didn't know what to say. I could only stand there, watching everything we'd built fall apart. I could see the love in his eyes turning to hatred, and the light in them fading away. It was unbearable to watch. Leave, he whispered, his back turned to me. I don't want to see you. Tears poured down my face, but deep down, I knew this was the end. I deserved it, but the pain was still crushing. I packed my things and left. I closed the door behind me, a door that would never open again. I found a small apartment downtown, but the ghosts of the past never left. Each morning, I woke up with a crushing sense of guilt and shame. I had ruined my life and Ethan's and Liam's. I tried reaching out to Liam, but he had distanced himself as well. I couldn't continue living in this painful void. In the end, I was left alone, with a broken heart and an emptiness that filled my life. What had once been full of love and stability had now turned into a daily struggle of regret and isolation. I had lost everything that had mattered to me, and now all I could do was try to find a way to move forward, knowing the guilt would never leave me. The end was harsh and unforgiving, and I knew now that I had to live with the consequences, day by day. The past could never be undone.